Hail and well met, geeky people. Are you ready to talk about world building? About the art of creation? Well, that's not exactly what I'm going to talk about today. I'm more interested in the craft of world building, in the function over form. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that the form and all the fancy little details are not super important. They are, but I think that particularly on YouTube, there's already a lot of videos about that. I can talk, and I'm sure you can talk for hours about all the fun little details that it's nice to put into your world, create these little societies, fill up a city with NPCs, come up with your own explanation for magic and the planes. It's all really, really fun stuff. But if you don't have a solid foundation, all of that is not really going to shine. So today, I want to look at a world that I made called Mendrealm. Here's the map for it, but we don't really care about the map. Today, I care about this mental map. We're going to be filling this out and talking about how I identified the world that I need, and I started adding in details to come back to those needs. Why? So that I could create the perfect world for my players that were coming to my professional games. In order to move forward, it's important to know where we're starting. For my situation, it's summer 2020, and I am a professional dungeon master at a little local game store. Now, there was this thing that happened that suddenly made it impossible for us to run our otherwise really successful D&D summer camps and after schools for children and weekly campaigns for paying adults. We've shifted online. I've gotten things set up for my DM staff to run games. Now it's time for me to look at the world that I want to present for my players. The focus here is mostly going to be on my adult players, although I incidentally wound up using this world for the kids' games as well. So, what is important? I need a successful event that customers will keep coming back to week after week. That much is plain to see. However, success can be hard to define. Whether you're a professional gamer or you're running kitchen table games, I'm going to encourage you to further define what success means for you. What that means for me in my situation, summer 2020, is I need something simple that cuts down on my own prep time. It cuts down on player buy-in, what they have to do to get ready, in part because I know that they are, A, spending money, B, spending time figuring out Zoom and Roll20 and all that jazz. So they don't need to also spend time figuring out all the lore of Eberron or all the lore of my homebrew world. Finally, I want to increase player immersion. This is because I need them to keep coming back. That is a reality. I need to keep a job, and my little game store needs to keep making money because I don't know if y'all are aware, but we lost a whole lot of game stores in 2020 and 2021, and I didn't want mine to be one of those. So let's mark our success over here with a $sign. What else do I need? Part of getting people immersed is the game needs to be in an enjoyable setting, right? And an enjoyable setting is going to be different for a lot of people. For me, I actually like a lot of R-rated action movies and horror. Berserk is my favorite series of all times. But if there was ever not a time to go grimdark, it's during this thing that's going on right now. So I want bright themes that do identify some loss, but there is a way out for our characters. This is not the most subtle thing in the world. After all, I wound up calling the world Mendrealm. It's a world that is broken, but you can fix it. I want to build empathy between the players and their characters and the world around them to make accessing roleplay easier, because accessing the game, for most people anyway, learning Roll20 is going to be harder. Finally, let's not forget that I am running a 5th edition D&D game. I need to offer this product. So, we have our money sign over here. We have teetering. Our whole little operation is on 5th edition D&D. There's some parts that are outside of our control with that. And finally, up here in this corner, I want to add this cozy little campfire. Look at his cute face. This is how I want my players to feel. I want to create a nice little safe place where they can come in and immerse themselves in their D&D campaign with their new online friends, because we don't want to think about the world outside. Let's talk about the D&D side of things. The Dungeon Master's Guide does provide us with a few core assumptions that we can use when world building. These are not laws, but this is going to be important to stay close to if we want our players to have that easy buy-in. The gods oversee the world. Much of the world is untamed. The world is ancient. Conflict shapes the world's history, and the world is magical. I'm not going to be sticking totally close to these, and there's one in particular that I'm about to turn on its head, but I want you to bear these in mind and at least look at this page if you have the Dungeon Master's Guide before you start going off and making your whole big world. All right, we know that I'm going to be running 5th edition D&D. We need to make a profit. Sorry guys, it's there. And we do want people to have a really good time and immerse themselves and forget about the outside world and just have a good time. These 3 things are the foundation for which we are going to fill in the rest of our world with. It's time to get a little creative. First thing that I am going to add to this world, and I'm only going to have 3 things, because as soon as somebody comes in and starts making their character, I only have maybe a paragraph's worth of info to say, here's your building blocks about the backstory of my world. I don't want to send them to my own personal wiki article. The first thing we need to know about this world's history is the fracture. This is an idea that I had played around with in another one of my homeworlds that I wanted to bring into play here. The idea behind the fracture is that 200 years ago, there was a great arcane library, and because of an enormous war between dragons and giants, the library was destroyed. And not only was this an affront to the knowledge held within the library, but it was an affront to the gods, and it was an affront to magic itself. All of the spells that were written down in those books burned away from the memories of the people in the world. This was a huge shift. Magic and history, languages suddenly started breaking down. It is a reset. This is important. The world doesn't really have a history beyond 200 years. If you can see some issues with that, don't worry. Put a pin in it. We'll come back to it. What's important to know right now is that this world only has been around essentially for 200 years. It is kind of cut off from the rest of the material world. It's its own little pocket place. And why is this important? Because in a world with very little lore, you, the new players, are now the ones making the lore. You are the ones driving forward the conflict and the history that will make not only your little story, but the big story of what is happening in Mindrealm. The next core tenet of this world that we are going to build is called the Nationspell. Before I describe what the Nationspell is, it's important to lay out some problems that I've had in the past and how I'm going to solve them. And one big problem that I have is 5e does not like big army combat. A lot of players coming to D&D, particularly new players who have seen, Lord of the Rings, or they've played Skyrim, they think that there is this big, huge battle between good and evil, and that they will take part in these cinematic battles. And that can work. there are DMs who have made this work, but there is not a good system to do this in 5e. No, I don't feel like playing the Dragonlance board game that you have to buy separate from the book. We're not going to get into that. The reviews have not been great. I'm not excited about it. Anyway, I want to break this down, not because of something I don't like, not to poo-poo on somebody's fun that they want to have with giant armies, but rather to empower the players and make them realize that in 5e, your player characters are superheroes and you can do this. I'm granting power to parties and individuals. This feeds back into the idea of the fracture, that you have an impact on this world. There are not these ancient 1,000-year-old dynasties that have raised up armies. All right? Now, how is this starting to connect back to our goals? Well, when people see that they can affect the world on a minute scale, that's going to increase our investment and our immersion. It's going to increase our connection to 5e and the fact that you can do a lot with your party. You don't have to call on a big army or 7 of them to go fight the Darkspawn. And it's going to make you feel cozy because you are going to build trust with your small party, your small group of people that has a big change in the world together. What does the Nationspell do? We have no war. When this world was created anew in the fracture, people could look around and they could see all the ruins of this terrible conflict between dragons and giants. They can see the bones, they can see all the rusted armor on the ancient battlefields, and they say, whatever was going on here, we don't want to do that. And over time, the great wizards or dragons, we don't have time to get into it. They got together, they wrote down a magical law that spread like a curse over the land that essentially held in any organization, any nation, to small borders, small population. And if they started extending those borders and raising armies, bad things would happen. What are the bad things? Well, we might get to that later. I think that's going to be another video. The bottom line is we don't have big wars. We don't have big armies. We don't have huge nations. There are still nobles. There are still little guilds. There are still little factions, but it is very hard for them to interact with each other without seeking out a little mercenary band, a little adventuring party. Now it's time for our last big idea, our last core tenet of Mindrealm, and that is that there are only 10 dragons in the world. These are the 10 last dragons. Did they survive from the Great War that destroyed the Arcane Library and the Fracture? Maybe they did, but they don't remember anything about it. Were they summoned up by the powers of creation and the outer planes into this world? Maybe. What matters is they are the most powerful forces in this world. And because all records of the gods and their divine magic have been blasted away from the land and the minds of its creatures, these new dragons are going to be our gods. As far as what kind of dragons I wanted here, I wanted these dragons to have personality. I didn't want them to be big beastie dragons like you might find in Dragon Age games. We'll go back to there. I do love that game series. The dragon fights in that, very, very cool. But they have this very bestial nature. That's something I wanted to avoid here. I want them to have personality. I want you to be able to talk with them like you talk to Draco. And yes, I did do the voice for one of them. Anyway, I took 5 elements of creation. I said, let's take life, death, fire, ice, and storm. Each dragon is going to get 2 of them. This starts to look a little like the Selesnya factions in Magic, and that's okay. I actually had some Magic players, and they could kind of latch on to that idea. So I have these 10 dragons. They're very powerful. They have some specific elements and maybe some alignments, maybe some domains. I did list the domains that each dragon would have as part of their religion. Why is this good? Well, I've always found the core Forgotten Realms gods of D&D to actually be a little obscure to really get into. They're mentioned in the player handbook, but they're just on a table. It says, here's this guy, here's Torm, here's what he's about. And I'm like, oh, cool, tell me more about Torm. And they say, no. So I'm like, okay, then we'll take a dragon. And if I have a player that finds the dragon of fire and ice particularly cool, now I have time to sit back and develop that as part of my allotted prep time for that week. And this is something that wound up happening. At first, I didn't have stories about all 10 dragons, and in fact, some of them had left the land and disappeared or were killed by another dragon. But if somebody said, I want to learn more about Altor, the dragon of fire and ice. You said he's a great magician. He's the ambassador to the magocracy over here. I would say, yes, Altor. Let me get that to you next week. And then I would write up what Altor was really all about and go find a good stat block and maybe spice it up. So we have essentially a pantheon of the world that is very evocative, goes back to the core themes of Dungeons and Dragons, after all. And we didn't have to work very hard on it. Our players can look at the 10 dragons and start to see what they're about, but then say, ooh, tell me more about that one. That one's my favorite. Finally, how does this tie into things? Well, I haven't mentioned my starting adventure, at least not in this video. You've already seen the starting adventure, or a lot of you did, in my Steal This Villain video. In there, we learn that an 11th dragon has been born. This foundation, setting up the fact that there are only 10 dragons left in the world and they are basically gods, would not be important if it was in the Forgotten Realms or if it was in Dragon Age. But it's very important now that we've set this up, because there's an 11th dragon, there's a new god in the world, and they might be evil and we should kill them by any means necessary right now. Excellent story hook. People were able to latch onto this by me only telling them, here's the world, it has been hit by the fracture, there is very little history, you'll be making it. There is a Nationspell, meaning that there are no big wars, there's no big border expansion, it's all tiny little towns that need help in this wild world, and there are only 10 dragons, the 11th was just born. How does that make your character feel? All right, we have a complete mental map of how I made Mendrealm, a setting that wound up being very successful for me and making some of the absolute best adventures I have ever ran, professional or otherwise. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on some of my big ideas that you all might feel like taking, and you are welcome to it. I want to recognize a few problems that some of you probably already thought of, because you're DMs and you're smart and you're players and you're smart. So you can find out some problems. That's okay. Dungeons and Dragons is ultimately a game of problem solving, and dungeon mastering is much the same. Let's touch on the fracture, this idea that 200 years ago, the world hit a reset button. We're cut off from the rest of the material world. So it's time for us to make our own history. Well, any American can tell you that a lot can happen in 200 years, actually. 200 years is a pretty big amount of time, and while I didn't want to make that personal Wikipedia page of lore for my world, the further on that I went and the further into inviting players in who said, ooh, do you have Tabaxi here? And I said, no, there's no Tabaxi. Where would you like the Tabaxi be? Ooh, I would like for them to be over here, please. All right, I'll write a little blurb about that. I actually wound up having a lot to say about that 200 years. And sometimes it was the players making the lore, not me. So if I were making Mendrealm again, I think I would not do 200. I think I would actually do 20. And that would amplify all the good things that I want people to feel, all of the tragedy of the loss of this library, the tragedy of the loss of people's memories would become much more personal and much further away from the huge, huge blocks of lore that I wanted to avoid in a place like Forgotten Realms. The other biggest problem of the Fracture is that a lot of my players immediately saw this as a narrative hook, as a mystery to solve. Ooh, how did it happen? How can we recover it? And my answer to this, really coming from an idea of radical acceptance, is I'm sorry. There's no way to fix this. What happened happened. This is the world now. It is up to you to solve it and make the most of this situation. And I'll mention again, I'm not subtle and I know it, but people didn't love this. And this does clash a little bit with our cute little campfire. I was trying to make something good here and not everyone accepted it, or at least not everyone accepted this initially. On the bright side, because of the mystery here, I was able to weave in some nice narratives later on. Let's jump from the Fracture and talk about the Nationspell. I actually don't have many negatives to talk about here. The Nationspell is, I think, one of my most original ideas. And as soon as I've said that, I'm sure somebody can tell me in the comments what 3 fantasy series did something like this before, and that's okay. I get that. It was really cool. I had a lot of player engagement from this, and a lot of people who actually, vocally or not, realized how cool it was that they got to do a lot here. You don't have to go summon up an army to defend Helm's Deep, because you can defend Helm's Deep. It's not 10,000 orcs, it's maybe 30. But people did want to know the rules of the Nationspell. They wanted to see the magical law that was written out. Once again, my answer here was frustrating to some people because I said, you don't know. The law was written long ago by the dragons, a council of the dragons that got together. And one thing is, as soon as they wrote it, they wanted it to go away so that nobody could go in and change it because they thought they were right. Naturally, they were not. The Nationspell had some terrible implications for the world and sometimes for the players when they tried to break it. So I understand the frustration of not knowing the rules, but I don't want to write out the rules because that actually takes a lot of time to write up even a really good infernal contract. It would take a lot of time for me to write out exactly how this curse on the whole land works. So I didn't want to do that. It is what it is. And finally, we come to the last dragons, that is the most classical element and probably the weakest element of the world. It sets up a checklist. It says, oh, there's 10 dragons, maybe 2 or 3 of them are dead, but we're going to meet all 10, or we're going to meet an NPC who is a cleric of each of these 10 dragons. And that didn't exactly happen. That wasn't something that I wanted, and I probably should have recognized. So my warning there to you for making your own little mental map for setting up, here's a core thing. Think about how is this going to manifest as a quest, or worse yet, how would players assume this would manifest as a quest? We come to some show don't tell issues. Again, I said I didn't want to fully flesh out all of these dragons. I only had an allotment of so much prep time I could spend each week, so I couldn't front load this and really develop every dragon the way I would want to in a home game. I had to get to it when I got to it. So sometimes just saying, oh, this dragon is all about this and you'll have to trust me on that and meet them later, didn't work out at the right timing. And finally, similar to, I think the Fracture should have actually been 20 years ago, I probably could have gotten away with only 5 dragons. A couple of these games actually ran for almost 2 years, and we didn't get to meet all 10 dragons or see the significance of them, so I think it could have been 5. These are all just little kind of nitpicks about my world, and it's not even that big a list. Overall, I think Minderom was very successful. I was able to run at least 7 campaigns plus a few short one-shots using this world as a backdrop, and it's definitely one that I would revisit if I get to do some more professional games in the future. Let's review the mental loot hoard that I'm sending you home with. This is how you can make world-building foundations by looking at the function before you look at the form, all the cool stuff. First, identify your goals. What is your group's backstory? Consider, what does success mean to you? Then, once you have that outer framing, figure out a few core tenets of your world. It doesn't have to be 3 like I did. It could be 5. It could be 1. There are cool worlds that have been built off of one big what if question. Revisit the core assumptions in the DMG and consider how you're adhering to them or recognizing where you differ. Fill in the creative bits as you go. I've identified some pitfalls here that I hope you can avoid. Remember to connect your creativity and your imagination back to your goals and your tenets. And if you can, try to include your players. They will thank you for it, and I think you'll thank yourself for it. Not only does it take work off your plate, but you benefit from collaborative creativity with your friends. Including my players on the creative process and never stopping to continue building on the foundation I made before is what helped my world go from this to this. A story that dozens of players will look back on fondly as the best part of this. Congratulations! You did it! You made it through the whole video! Take your XP and use it to level up your game. I hope this was enjoyable. I hope it was informational. If you have more questions and problems related to how to build the world as I outlined here, please put it in the comments. And if you have significant D&D ailments that you need a fix to, why don't you go to the D&D doctor? Yeah, that's right. I'll call myself that at TruesightDnd.com. Thank you again. Have a nat 20 day. Bye-bye.